Last week I created a video on Figma where I was showing you how to design inside of a 12-column grid. I had one person ask how I could take that grid and actually use that same grid inside GenerateBlocks, but of course that opens up Pandora's box into CSS Grid. So in today's video, I'm going to take a literal approach to showing you how you can replicate that same 12-column grid inside GenerateBlocks using CSS Grid. We'll also look at a more practical use case of how you might want to use CSS Grid once you understand kind of these basics and fundamentals. If that sounds interesting to you, then stick around and let's get started. So to get started, we're just going to start off with the blank page here inside GenerateBlocks. And the first thing we're going to do is add our container that will be the section we're working on. So here I just dropped in a container. We're going to go to our settings here and change that tag name to section since we want this to be our section. Now inside of it, we're going to add an inner container. All the inner container does is set the max width to whatever we've set inside GeneratePress. In this case, it's 1280 pixels. It's represented there by a variable, but I'll just go ahead and change that to 1280 just so we're making sure that we're crystal clear on everything. The other thing the inner container does is just go ahead and set your margin on the left and right to auto, which just centers this in the middle of the screen. Now we're going to need some content in here in order to visualize this grid that we create. So to do that, I'm just going to drop in a container. This is just going to be essentially a placeholder. I'm going to go ahead and make the height maybe just 200 pixels so we'll have something to see, and we'll change the background to maybe something like this blue color here. So now we see we have this container inside of our inner container. To make the grid, we actually want to work on the inner container. In fact, let's go ahead and rename this. I'll go ahead and rename this to inner container. We'll save that, and we'll rename this to our section. And then we'll just call this placeholder content. Now, in order to see all of our 12 columns, we're going to need 12 of these placeholder content pieces in here. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this 11 more times. So now you can see we have 12 different pieces of placeholder content inside this inner container, and now we can actually start going in and building out our grid. So we'll go back to our inner container here, and under layout, we're going to change the display from default to grid. Now nothing's going to change immediately because we need to set up how we want our grid to be structured, which can be done here under the grid layout. Now by default, GeneratePress gives us a few different presets, and if we click on any of these, we'll get a 3-column grid or 4-column grid. In our case, what we're after is a 12-column grid, and there's no preset for that, so we're going to have to build it. Now you could just go ahead and write your function from scratch, but since we already have one here that's pretty close, a 6-column grid, I think we could just use this and manipulate it to get our 12 columns. Essentially what this function is doing is just repeating 6 columns that are a minimum of 0 pixels and a maximum of 1 FR. Now this is just kind of a fancy way to create a grid layout that's a little bit responsive here. The only thing we need to change is change the 6, which is the number of columns, to 12. And this will make it more aligned with what we had inside of Figma. Now you can see each one of these columns are butted up right next to each other. And in Figma, we actually had a gap between them. So to do that, we're just going to go in here and into our alignment dropdown and change this column gap to 16, which will match what we had inside of Figma. So now if I just go ahead and close these so we make sure we're using the full width of our screen, we see we have our 12 columns across here, just like we did inside of our Figma drawing. In fact, just to prove it, I'll go ahead and just grab a screenshot of this here. We'll paste it into Figma, and you can see I can line this up perfectly with our 12-column grid inside of Figma. Well, maybe not pixel perfect, since it's like a half a pixel off here, but you can see all these are lining up just like they lined up inside of Figma. So now we've gone through and perfectly replicated this same 12-column grid we had in Figma inside GenerateBlocks. Now, if you'll remember back to that last video, we set some of these different pieces of content for different widths inside the grid. For instance, this headline here was taking up 10 columns. This excerpt was taking up 8 columns, and this image is taking up 12 columns. We can do that same thing using our grid that we built inside GenerateBlocks. We just need to understand how CSS Grid actually numbers those columns. The grid numbering system starts with number 1, which starts on the left edge of our first column. Now you can kind of ignore the gap here when we're talking about CSS Grid, and here just where these first column and second 2 columns meet, we can change this to 2. Now I'll go ahead and number this all the way to 12. With CSS Grid, you really want to think about where a column starts and where it ends. So this very first column here, if we just wanted something that took up this first column, it would start at 1 and end at 2. If we wanted something that took up the first 3 columns, it would start at 1 and end at 4. Now, because of this, we actually need to put a 13 in here, which is going to be the end of our 12th column here. So for example, going back to our headline here, we actually want it to start on 2 and end on 12, which will take up the 10 columns in the center of our design here. So let's go back inside GenerateBlocks, and we'll go ahead and grab this first column here. I'm going to go ahead and open up the list view, and we'll open up all our settings on the side so we can start working with this. Now, just like I said, we want this to start on column 2 and end on 12. To do that, I'm just going to select this first box here. We're going to go into Layout, and under Grid Layout, we'll scroll down until we see Grid Column. This is where we can declare which columns inside the grid we want this piece of content to live. So we said we wanted this to start at 2, so we'll start at 2. We'll do a /, and we'll end this at 12. Now we can see this first piece of placeholder content is spanning 10 of our columns here. It's skipping the first one because we said to start on number 2, and it's spanning all the way to the 12th one here. Now we'll just use this second piece of placeholder content as our excerpt. If we go back inside of Figma, we can see that this one starts on 3 and ends on 11. So again, we'll go in here, we'll make sure we're selecting this one, and under Layout, Grid Layout, under Grid Columns, we'll start with 3 / 11. And now we can see the second one here is spanning 8 columns in the center of our design. Now, it gets a little bit confusing because we can no longer see all these grids across here, but you can see each one of these placeholder pieces of content just fit into the next cell of the grid. The next piece of content was our featured image. It spanned all the way across, so we can go in here into Layout, Grid Column, and we can do 1/13, which is just going to make sure that it spans across the entire grid. We'll reference our Figma drawing again and take a look at our metadata and our content. We can see that's starting on grid column 4 and it's ending on grid column 10. So we'll go in here and we'll just go ahead and grab this next piece of content and the one that follows it. This one would be our metadata, and this one would be all of our content. Layout, we'll make sure that we're inside this layout grid, and we'll do 4/10. So now these two pieces of content are starting on grid column 4 and ending on 10, which aligns perfectly with the grid we had designed inside of Figma. Just to make it a little bit more realistic, I've gone ahead and pasted the contents of that blog post design here inside of GenerateBlocks, and we'll go through and set up our grid again. Like we did before, I'm going to go into our wrapper, into Layout. I'm going to change the display to Grid. I'm going to go ahead and use this 6-column preset, but we'll change it to 12. Now you can see everything looks pretty terrible right now because we need to assign which columns each one of these pieces of content should live in. We'll go to our headline here, under Layout, Grid Column, and this one's going to span 2 to 12. For our excerpt, Layout, Grid Column, this one was 3 to 11. Our featured image was from 1 to 13. And both our metadata and post content was from 4 to 10. Now, of course, we need to center align this text here and center align this excerpt here. But just like that, we were able to replicate that same layout here inside GenerateBlocks and make sure everything's fitting on the grid just like we did before. Now, I'm conscious of the fact that what I've showed you so far is a pretty good visual representation of how CSS Grid works, but it's not a very practical one. Would I use this exact approach if I was creating this layout? Probably not. So let me show you something where CSS Grid is actually a little bit more applicable. Something like this is a great candidate for using CSS Grid, so let's talk about how we might set this up. Here we have a section, inside of it, a headline with the related post, and then we have a wrapper that's containing all 3 of these blog post cards. This wrapper is what we'd set to CSS Grid, and it has 1, 2, 3 columns. Now inside of each one of these cards, we just have a featured image, a title, and a date. We can easily set this up inside GenerateBlocks, learning what we learned today about CSS Grid. So back here inside GenerateBlocks, I've gone ahead and dumped in all this content, but I haven't done any of the grid stuff we need. Just like in Figma, we have a section with an inner container. Inside of that is this heading for our latest articles, the wrapper that wraps around all of our grid cards, and then each one of our cards individually. Of course, each one of those have the image, headline, and date in them, but we're not too worried about that for this purpose. We'll go here to our cards grid, which is the wrapper that's holding all of our cards, and we'll change the display from default to grid. Now in our grid layout, we can actually take advantage of these presets here and just use this 3-column grid, which is just repeat 3 min max 0 1 FR, which is just the function we need here to create this 3-column grid. Of course, we need some space in between each of these, so we'll go back into our alignment and add 16 pixels of gap in between those. Just like that, we've used CSS Grid to create an even 3-column layout. This is definitely a use case where I would use CSS Grid because it's a whole lot simpler to do than using Flexbox to achieve the same layout. Especially if we wanted to do even more of these cards in here. If I grabbed this one and just kept duplicating it, these cards would just continue to fill in this grid automatically, which is a huge benefit of using CSS Grid. With Grid, the parent actually controls the layout instead of with Flexbox where all the children have a little bit more control. Just to show you that, I'll go back here to this grid's card, and where we had this set to a 3-column grid, if I wanted to change this to a 4-column grid, all I have to do is change this function from repeat 3 to repeat 4, and automatically all of these are now in a 4-column grid and have been resized appropriately. And just like before, if we wanted one of these to span multiple columns, we could grab this first card here, for instance, and under grid column, we could do 1/3, which means it would span all the way from the first column here all the way to number 3. So this first one is twice as wide as the rest of them. A little shortcut for doing that, instead of doing 1/3 and being really explicit about where it starts, you could just do span 2, and that means it will span 2 columns. Just like that, we could do span 3 or span 4, and we can control how many columns it's going to span. Now with the span function, it's just going to start wherever it already lives inside the grid, but if you wanted to declare that maybe this exact card should start on 2 and span all the way to 4, you can control that with these more granular controls. In most cases, I'm usually using span because I'm just wanting to span a certain amount of columns exactly where it sits right now and not necessarily manipulate it to put it on a specific column. Although, like our example earlier, when we're building out the body of the blog post, there are cases where you do need to specify which column it starts and ends on. The interesting thing about CSS Grid is that it can be as simple or as complex as you want it to be. Doing something like this 3-column grid is a great use case for using CSS Grid, and it's definitely on the simple side. But you can get into really complex layouts, including overlapping elements, all using the same CSS Grid framework. I'll leave a couple links down in the description below where I've explored some CSS Grid things before, and I would encourage you to go seek resources like Kevin Powell, who's done all kinds of content on CSS Grid, which is really how I cut my teeth on it. If you enjoyed today's video, I would really appreciate a thumbs up, and if you want to make sure to catch the next one, hit subscribe, and we'll see you then.